Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 32 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Los Angeles Kings, in which the Sharks have lost 3-2 in the shootout. And this is one of those games where the narrative sort of changes based on how the result ended up being, and this is somewhat frequent when it comes to these games that end in the shootout because it's so far away from just the basic game of hockey. Shootout is just completely different, which is why a lot of people don't actually like that games in the regular season can be decided by the shootout. But this is a situation in which, had the Sharks won, the narrative likely would have been, oh, this was a solid road game, good goaltending, opportunistic scoring, a solid 2 points. But because the Sharks actually end up coming out on the losing end of things, this is probably going to be viewed as a situation where, oh, the Sharks, they didn't get enough chances, they didn't play a full 60 minutes and all of those types of things, when in reality, while the Sharks weren't amazing here tonight, they played okay and matched up to the Kings decently well. They just ended up coming out on the losing end in an essential coin flip in the skills competition. Now, starting off in the first period, this was honestly a game in which the Sharks, on average, over the full 60 minutes, didn't look that bad, actually played pretty decent, maybe slightly outplayed by the Los Angeles Kings, but many of the San Jose Sharks' chances kind of came in spurts. They had moments where it was just down here, and then they would have few minutes of play in which they were all the way up here, and so in the first period, that was definitely the case. The Kings would strike first on this one with a Danault power play goal, and during this time, the Sharks really couldn't get much zone time, really couldn't get many shots on net, but then eventually things turned the other direction. The Sharks started getting some pressure and got a goal for themselves on the power play from Timo Meier to make it 1-1, but eventually that spurt would run out and the Kings would kind of take back over, and that would carry into the second period where the Kings would get the majority of the chances early on, but then once again the Sharks would bring it back. They'd have a few minutes of solid play, they'd get a goal from Kevin Labanc, but that would not last particularly long, as not even a minute later it would be Anderson Dolan scoring his third of the season. And interesting fact, not a fun one, but an interesting one, he now has 5 points on the season. Anderson Dolan has 3 of them coming against San Jose, 2 of his 3 goals being against San Jose as well, so I don't know what the situation is there, but he seems to have the Sharks number. And that was the final score at the end of the second period, 2-2. And then in the third period, it started off okay, but things definitely slowed down as time wore on. It seems as though both teams were playing very, very safe. The Kings, having recently played a decent chunk of games, they've had a very condensed schedule thus far this season. Meanwhile, the Sharks were the much more rested team, not really having played much in the last week or so, and yet both teams kind of just feeling each other out in those last few minutes of the third period. The Sharks would get a power play opportunity, but even then, there really wasn't much generated there, and both teams seemed relatively content just bringing this game to overtime so that they would both end up with a point. Now, in that overtime, it was relatively interesting to say the least. Within just the first few seconds of the overtime, the Sharks would actually end up getting a power play for themselves, as Timo Meier would get slashed by Philippe Danault, and it was a 4-on-3 power play. The Sharks, you would think that would be a very good opportunity to at least get some chances, and yet there really wasn't much doing on this power play, and this is one of the reasons I actually don't like overtime power plays, is that when a team doesn't score on them, the overtime ends up in a 4-on-4 situation as opposed to the usual 3-on-3 situation, and 4-on-4 just feels a lot more congested on the ice compared to the usual high-flying and high chances 3-on-3 play. And yet, while the first minute or so of the 2 minutes that these teams played at 4-on-4 was kind of slow, with the teams just sort of skating around in the neutral zone a lot, it did definitely open up in the latter half of that 4-on-4 shift. However, when I say that, I don't mean it opened up for both teams, but it mostly just opened up for the Los Angeles Kings, as they pelted Reimer with multiple very good opportunities, and Reimer had to come up with a ton of great saves to keep the Sharks alive and bring them to the shootout, where they wouldn't really be able to do much. It would go to 4 rounds. Labanc would score 1 goal for the San Jose Sharks, but he was the only Shark who actually pulled out any sort of deke move in this shootout. The other 3 just kind of went for very basic shots that were ending up saves for Phoenix Copley. Meanwhile, Reimer lets in 2 against the Kings, and as such, the Sharks miss out on the extra point. On to the players to talk about. We once again have the first line here for the San Jose Sharks: Meier, Hertl, and Labanc. Probably the Sharks' best line. I don't think that's necessarily too controversial to say. Timo Meier really doing a lot here in tonight's game, but I actually want to focus a bit more onto Tomas Hertl, who I felt as though found himself in situations to score goals here tonight, but he was never really ready when in those situations to actually put them in. I felt like as though there were like at least 3 opportunities where you're looking at this one, the puck comes near Hertl, and you're like, oh, if he could only have gotten his stick on that puck, he would have been able to get the easy tap-in goal. But unfortunately, it felt as though he was like one small step behind things that were happening in this game. This isn't necessarily a criticism of him, because it is still a situation where he found himself in those positions to be able to score. It's just that he just wasn't quick enough. He felt as though he was just one half step behind, which was rather unfortunate, as the Sharks, that could have been a difference maker in a game that was, of course, 2-2 at the end of regulation. And then, of course, Kevin Labanc continues to earn his spot on this top line, manages to put up another goal here. Meier draws a lot of pressure to him, as he was doing for much of this game, and Labanc is the beneficiary who has all the time in the world to pick his shot, goes for the one-timer anyway, and it just barely squeaks through Copley for his goal. And so generally a solid game for the first line. Now on the second line, we had the return of Barabanov to the lineup. Only missed about a game, but Gregor gets bumped down from the second line to the third line as Barabanov joins Couture and Bonino once more. This second line was not particularly good. Barabanov did not have a very good game at all. Bonino had a couple of decent offensive looks. I will give him that. Ever since he has come up to the second line, it feels as though his offensive game has taken a step forward, though I should note that this is now the first time in 4 or 5 games that Bonino did not actually score a goal. In his previous 4 games, he had a goal in each of them, so there goes the Nick Bonino goal streak. But besides those those couple of offensive opportunities, it felt as though this second line found themselves in the defensive zone a lot, which is definitely par for the course for any line, but that Nick Bonino features on. When it comes to the third line, now it is of course a new one put together because Gregor gets bumped from the second to the third. He joins Sturm and Svechnikov, and I thought this third line actually looked okay. A couple of good opportunities, I thought, for Gregor as usual. Svechnikov got into it a bit, at the very least physically, so there is that if you want to give it as a positive, and he was, decent in the offensive zone, though not amazing. Nico Sturm, I actually thought, had a pretty solid game, which is a good thing, because while I think Nico Sturm really started this season very, very well for San Jose and obviously got a lot of his goals in the early parts of the year, it felt as though he kind of fell down through that middle part thus far of these 31 or now 32 games that the Sharks played, from like game maybe 15 to 25 to 30. Nico Sturm didn't necessarily play that well, but it's nice to see him really picking things up over these past couple of games. When it comes to the fourth line, this line has been a lot better as of late. I have spoken the praises of Lorenz over these past few games, and to a lesser extent Jonah Gadjevich, but this game was definitely a massive step back for this fourth line. In particular, the weakest link continues to be Oscar Lindblom, and he just had an absolute rough game. I mean, just looking at his play on this shift goal for Anderson Dolan was just completely embarrassing to see. This is the player on the San Jose Sharks who most is deserving to be a healthy scratch, and yet he continues to find himself in the lineup game after game. I believe he has only been a healthy scratch 1 time thus far this season, when he's probably deserved 10 times that at this point. He's just complete dead weight, it feels, no offense to him, on this fourth line. When it comes to the defensive side of things, I do want to mention Karlsson. Now, usually I mention Karlsson on the offensive side of things, but here tonight, it didn't really feel as though there was necessarily all that much coming from number 65. He definitely had some solid plays in the overtime when there was more open space to work with, but it feels as though, I don't know if it was Karlsson playing poor or the Kings doing a very good job at covering him, but it felt as though while Karlsson was getting, his usual base amount of opportunities, there wasn't really that sort of next level move from Erik Karlsson that we have seen so frequently from the defensive leading scorer around the entire league. So that was slightly disappointing, I guess. And then when it comes to the second pairing, it really feels as though Vlasic and Benning have kind of fallen off of a cliff a bit over these past few games. I mean, I won't say that they were awful against the Ducks and the Coyotes, but those two are not necessarily the best of teams. But definitely prior to that, this line or this pairing that was really deemed to be the defensive pairing for the San Jose Sharks have found themselves defending a bit too much in my eyes. Yes, they're playing against the top competition on the other team, but you're kind of hoping that they're not necessarily as much of a sort of defensive deficit to your team playing so much in the defensive zone. You kind of want them pushing the pace a bit, not necessarily generating great chances for themselves, but keeping it out of their own zone and playing a bit more in the neutral zone at the very least, and they just haven't really been doing that. And then finally, I do want to talk about the goaltender here for the Sharks, James Reimer. His previous performance against the Los Angeles Kings obviously left a lot to be desired. If you remember, it was a situation where Reimer was injured prior to the game, came back against the Kings, played horribly, and then went back onto the injured reserve and then missed a few games. So clearly that was a situation where he wasn't really ready and 100% healthy to return to that game, and that's why he played so poorly. Now in this rematch against Los Angeles, he definitely looked significantly better. One of the main reasons why the San Jose Sharks even managed a single point here tonight. I will say the two goals that he did let in weren't necessarily the most impressive goals. The Danault one was just sort of a backhand that he probably could have saved. The Anderson Dolan one definitely raising the difficulty, but still not impossible. But based on the almost 40 other saves he made, it was still a very good game for Reimer. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow, where they will take on the Calgary Flames. Another team in their own division, another team who is definitely better than some of the more recent competition that the Sharks have faced off against, and we will see how they fare. Class dismissed.